interesting. You got stuff like the 2099 Incredible Hulk and like 2099 Punisher and Doctor Doom and different things along those lines, but it's basically the future. Right now, instead of having like New York, what you have is Nueva York, just kind of like this future, super technologically advanced place. But by and large, the whole area is ran by Alchemax. And this is important because once Superior Spider-Man gets into this place, because he's somewhat familiar with 2099, that of course he's able to make his way through there to a degree. And he's basically set upon by what's referred to as the public eye. Now, the public eye in the 2099 universe, they're basically private police that are actually hired and work for Alchemax, the company that seemingly runs everything, or at least basically all of New York. But when this happens, of course, he's able to get past these guys quite readily, and then he's met by Gabriel O'Hara. Now, Gabriel O'Hara is the brother of Miguel O'Hara, also known as Spider-Man 2099. At the moment, he's not here, he's missing, he's actually out doing his own thing, and we'll follow up with him relatively soon. But the idea of Dr. Octopus, a really superior Spider-Man, being in this place, of course, he's greeted by Gabriel, and then he's like, I don't need you anymore, right? Like, all I want to do is find my way back home, back to my native universe, and we're gonna call it a day. Now, here's the funny thing about this. When it comes to Dr. Octopus, historically in the movies, his intelligence has been downplayed. Despite how smart you've seen him come off in the movies, he's not nearly as intelligent in the movies as he is in the comics. In the comics, he's light years ahead of everybody. He's like Tony Stark, right? He's a futurist. He's always thinking to the future, always looking to the horizon. And so he's basically given this kind of sentient AI computer system, which is partially self-aware but still has to follow the programming that's assigned to it, and asks it the best way to achieve interdimensional travel or time travel. Now, as you would expect, time travel is highly regulated in any one particular universe, and a lot of this falls in line with the nature of organizations like the Time Variance Authority itself, as well as the organizational structures of that particular universe. And what I mean by that is the TVA, as most of you guys probably know from the Loki series, albeit that series was a little bit different from the comics, that it is by and large governed by the Timekeepers. And the goal of the Timekeepers is to basically ensure their existence, right? That they come into existence at the end of time, and they want to make sure that like nothing happens across the multiverse that prevents them from existing. And so they closely monitor individuals who travel back and forth through time, making sure they don't disrupt the time stream too much. So there's that kind of regulation that goes into it. At the same time, if you're a massive company like Alchemax and you have all this power, you don't want anybody going back in time and preventing your company from existing. And so that's the kind of regulation you end up seeing. People who are meddling with time and like disrupting existing status quos, or possibly even sending the universe on a collision course to a far worse future than the one that currently exists. So there's all kinds of things you can screw up with time, and that's why it's monitored so closely. Fortunately for us, Superior Spider-Man doesn't care. It doesn't matter to him. And in fact, he actually ends up breaking into all these different facilities and stealing all these different things he needs in order to attain the ability to travel through time or to move from one dimension or one universe to the next. Now, with Dr. Octopus, he can get away with that, right? It's like giving Tony Stark the ability to achieve time travel. Just part and parcel of his intelligence is knowing there's some things you just can't do, right? You can't disrupt time too much. You've got to be very, very careful. Another part of this is that as he's been working with this AI, and this is a particularly important point going forward, he actually tells it to start modifying its physical appearance so it looks like Anna Maria Marconi. Now, the reason why that matters is Anna Maria Marconi was a diminutive woman who was also incredibly intelligent and actually challenged Otto Octavius in a lot of different ways. She believed he was Peter Parker. She didn't really know the truth. She found out later on, but she was one of the few people out there that kept pushing him to be better. And so because of the fact that she was not content with mediocrity, she would call him out when he was wrong. She would say like, you're better than what you currently are right now. It wasn't just, I like you as you are, and that's fine, right? She wanted to see him become better to live up to his full potential, that he actually developed a huge amount of respect for her and then started falling in love with her. And so he basically misses her. And that all ties into the nature of Superior Spider-Man, right? Dr. Octopus basically reforming, becoming a hero instead of a villain, forming Parker Industries, which actually became like this worldwide multi-billion-dollar philanthropy-based organization. He created all these little pieces of technology that made Peter Parker's life better as Spider-Man. It was really, really cool in terms of how all that stuff worked. But once the actual system is set up and he's ready to travel, one of the things that he had done is created a snapback protocol so that if he ends up jumping into an alternate universe and like it's in the middle of a meteor crashing into it and everyone's dying, he can snap back. Because wouldn't it suck if he traveled to a new universe and a meteor was about to crash into it, he had like 10 seconds to live, and that was that, right? Like it would really blow balls. And so once he ends up passing through, because of the nature of traveling through the multiverse is not as simple as simply just jumping back to a period in time, trying to travel through space and time, the fact that the multiverse actually moves the way the Earth orbits around the sun, that is a very, very precise system. And so he ultimately ends up missing where it is that he's supposed to be. Instead, he shows up in an alternate reality where Spider-Man had joined the Fantastic Four, and this version of Spider-Man's been killed. Not only that, he snaps back and ends up in an alternate reality, the House of M universe. Most of you guys have heard of that, the universe where the Scarlet Witch had basically rewrote reality to give everybody everything they subconsciously desired. Spider-Man in that universe is killed. Then he snaps back and ends up in a Civil War universe where basically the Civil War never ended, and that version of Spider-Man is killed. That every single universe he goes to, the Spider-Men in these different universes have all been killed. They've been executed. But the more crazy thing about this is they've all been killed in the exact same way. The two same puncture marks, right? So seemingly someone or something is traveling around the multiverse and killing all these different versions of Spider-Man. And so what it does is it switches over to what's probably one of the cooler versions of Spider-Man. Once Superior Spider-Man jumps back to 2099 and then jumps into the time stream again, you actually ended up in an alternate reality where you get Spider-Man India, which is cool. And then you find the guy who's basically killing everybody. Now, this thing here, this guy, he's what's called an inheritor. And we'll learn more about the inheritors as time goes on. The important thing, and really what Dan Slott gives us here, is that this guy, Spider-Man India, seemingly has all the same powers that you would expect from a Spider-Man, right? Like the powers of Peter Parker. So like the proportional strength of a spider, the ability to climb on walls, shoot webbing, different things like that. A lot of that stuff just kind of universal from one universe to the next. But this guy, this Spider-Man India, is getting totally wrecked by this inheritor, right? I mean, literally, he's just fleeing for his life. Nothing's working. Absolutely nothing is working here. And so what you end up getting is this kind of cat and mouse game, this incredible maneuver that's made by this inheritor, where he actually ends up forcing a building to crumble, which draws the attention of Spider-Man, because as you guys know, Spider-Man would never let innocent people die. And then in turn, because he's distracted, it's basically game over. There's no way for this guy to win. And then enter Superior Spider-Man, who saves this dude's life, right? Just saves this guy's life by an instant. I mean, this dude was like moments away from being killed. And so once this guy is basically defeated, of course, he's, we really have Superior Spider-Man telling us this guy's being held at bay. He starts talking to Spider-Man India. And what he says is that as he's been traveling through the multiverse, presumably trying to find his way home, his mission to get back to the main Marvel universe shifted, because every universe he came across, Spider-Men were being killed. And Dr. Octopus, being as intelligent as he is, deduced someone or something is hunting Spider-Man from across the multiverse, and so it's only a matter of time before they come for him. And so what he actually has been doing is assembling a team of different Spider-Men from across the multiverse, all of whom intend to face off against this guy, this person, that's basically taking them all out. And so once Spider-Man India is brought back to the Marvel 2099 universe, you end up seeing like 5 other Spider-Men, including Spider-Man Noir. But one of them is also Assassin Spider-Man, who's one of the coolest versions of the character. Okay, so here's the origin of Assassin Spider-Man, right? We're going to switch over to this. It's actually kind of a backup feature in Superior Spider-Man number 32. That what you end up finding out here is that somewhere along the line, the Green Goblin had actually murdered Gwen Stacy. And unlike the main Marvel universe, where the death of Gwen Stacy taught Peter Parker that he couldn't be reckless, in this alternate reality, the death of Gwen Stacy taught Spider-Man to take no prisoners. And so every single villain that he had, that he came across, he killed. He just executed them, right? Like Kraven the Hunter, he just killed them, as he should have been doing. And of course, one of the things that also goes on here is that because there are some threats out there that Spider-Man's going to have to contend with, and his skills aren't quite up to snuff, he actually ends up training with Wolverine. Now, this may seem kind of like weird to have him train with Wolverine, but it actually makes perfect sense. And the reason why is because Wolverine's trained a lot of people in Marvel Comics. Black Widow learned how to fight from Wolverine when she was in the Red Room. You had all kinds of people who were trained with this guy, right? It's one of these things in Marvel Comics, it's a hodgepodge. Somewhere along the lines, everybody's trained with everybody else. The only real exception to that, insofar as the one person that like everybody's trained with, is actually 2 people. And they're really more teachers than anything else. The first one is Taskmaster, right? Like Tony Masters. That guy, I mean, he's the guy you want to train with. He usually trains villains, but heroes have trained with him as well. But the other person, and probably the more significant trainer of heroes in Marvel Comics, is Shang-Chi. He's trained really almost everyone in some form or fashion. Even if there's someone like Wolverine that already had a formidable set of skills, all Shang-Chi did was hone clone them and make them better. So again, it's one of these things where Tony Masters and Shang-Chi are kind of like the 1-2 punch of people that you train with, but this guy, this version of Spider-Man training with Wolverine, made him far more ruthless and far more brutal because it's just the nature of Wolverine's training. And so, of course, when this inheritor showed up in that universe and immediately started going after that version of Spider-Man, the assassin Spider-Man, that Wolverine stepped in the way and Wolverine was totally incinerated, right? Of course, all that's really left is this adamantium skeleton. Now, this is one of those things where Marvel plays it fast and loose. If you read Days of Future Past, Marvel's like, yeah, man, Wolverine's entire skeleton was incinerated and he died. But then you go and you read a story like Civil War where Nitro blows up in front of Wolverine and reduces him down to his skeleton and he regrows, right? So it's one of those things where it just kind of goes either way. Wolverine's ability to heal from an injury is more of a plot device than anything else, especially when it's an injury this extreme. But what it does is it allows Assassin Spider-Man to basically temporarily gain the upper hand on this inheritor, even if only for a moment. Now, during this process, he's actually met by Alex. Now, we're not given a whole lot of information about Alex. All we really know is that she's basically the girl that this version of Spider-Man ended up with, that like the main Marvel Universe, that following the death of Gwen Stacy, Peter Parker, at least in this reality, ended up with Mary Jane Watson, but then along the way, he met Alex, he broke up with Mary Jane Watson, and got with Alex instead. Most likely it seems to be because the mentality Alex had is more in line with the mentality of Assassin Spider-Man, but at the end of the day, you actually get this really, really cool moment where Assassin Spider-Man's fighting the Inheritor, and he realizes his staff basically relies on energy, and so his response is, then we'll just overload it, right? So he actually leads him to this location, which is just a giant power battery, more or less. And as the two of them are fighting, the staff is temporarily overloaded. But at the end of the day, the Inheritor pulls it back out, and the fight's on again. It's one of these things where he's just kind of like, I'm entertained, right? Like, your death will be quicker than most, because, you know, you kind of gave me a good fight, right? I respect you, so I'm not going to kill you slowly. And so ultimately, this guy kind of just seems to be unstoppable. There's no real way for anyone to overcome him. But then what actually ends up happening is that while this fight's taking place, Superior Spider-Man shows up. He ends up ripping a tree out of the ground and throwing it at this dude and sending him flying. And so that's the explanation of how it is that as these two meet up, Superior Spider-Man had Assassin Spider-Man in his ranks because he saved yet another Spider-Man from being killed by one of the Inheritors. Now, at this point, we switch over to what's called the Edge of Spider-Verse. So the way the Spider-Verse was told, it was told in a couple different forms. The first is that you followed Superior Spider-Man, then you go into Edge of Spider-Verse, which is basically these stories that give you like either origins on different versions of Spider-Man or stories involving existing Spider-Man from across the multiverse in terms of how it all ties together and how they ended up as part of the Spider-Verse event. And so in this instance, we actually end up picking up with Spider-Man Noir, who's actually been around since 2009. So he appeared about 5 years before this story was written. And one of the things to know, the way Peter Parker gained his powers in this particular story, because the Marvel Noir series was designed to be a lot more grounded than what you saw in terms of just the traditional Marvel Comics line. So like radioactive spiders biting people, and instead of them succumbing to radiation poisoning, they get powers. The way you actually saw here was basically a kind of spider idol, which really seemed to be imbued with magical energy. So, I mean, I guess, you know, kind of grounded. I don't know. But regardless, Peter Parker in this universe was bitten by one of those spiders, and then he woke up with Spider-Man powers, as you would expect. What you also have here is somebody called the Magical Mysterio, or like the Amazing Mysterio. What's really going on here, and kind of an important thing to understand, these aren't really significant moments. We're really covering this because of the way that it ends. But basically, Mysterio is a guy, the Magnificent Mysterio, he's a guy vying for power, right? Wilson Fisk, Kingpin, is running New York. He's the guy that wants to take his place as like the new crime boss, is really all it is. And that's one of the things that kind of happens, is you have this bit of a discussion where like Wilson Fisk walks in on Mysterio, talking about how he's going to basically steal the powers of Spider-Man, and then in turn, he's going to be the one to run New York, right? So when you're Wilson Fisk, that stuff doesn't really bother you because you know that people are just going to come gunning for you at some point along the line. And so one of the things that goes on here is you actually have Wilson Fisk trying to gain information on the identity of Spider-Man. And that's been an ongoing theme in the Spider-Man Noir series for quite some time. They actually end up visiting Felicia Hardy. Now, Felicia Hardy was at one point in a relationship with a villain called the Crime Master, but was in love with Spider-Man Noir. And when the Crime Master learned this, he ended up slashing her face. And that's why she wears a white mask, because her face is scarred all to hell. And so because of that, it's basically like her saying, like, I don't know the identity of Spider-Man, I'm in love with him, but I don't know him personally. But while all this is happening, right, all these little plot threads and things like that are going on, Peter Parker in this universe is experiencing this kind of dull headache that just kind of seems to be sitting back there. There really doesn't seem to be any indication in terms of the fact that there's like an immediate threat. That's kind of how his spider sense manifests. It's sort of a dull pain, but it just kind of kicks in whenever any like massive event takes place So very, very similar to the spider sense of Peter Parker from the main Marvel universe. But what his sense is basically telling him is there's a threat out there somewhere. And it's a kind of a bit of an annoyance here, because if it's like, if there's a threat out there somewhere, like why doesn't the threat manifest itself, right? I mean, keep in mind, Peter Parker's spider sense doesn't tell him where the threat is coming from. It just says there is a threat there, kind of like a sixth sense. And he even refers to it as like an ESP to a degree. But during this whole thing, because of the fact that Mysterio is trying to get his hands on the blood of Spider-Man Noir for the purpose of finding a way to basically make himself someone that has powers akin to Spider-Man, that he actually ends up challenging Spider-Man Noir publicly in the newspapers by saying, like, there is going to be a girl you're going to have to rescue, right? Can you live up to the challenge? That kind of a thing. Now, behind the scenes, the indication is he's actually Mysterio really will kill this girl if Spider-Man Noir doesn't show up. And because he's a quote-unquote magician, the audience will believe it's a trick when it's actually real, right? And Spider-Man Noir will kind of have to live with that. So, of course, he ends up showing up here. And when that happens, he's overcome pretty quickly by a kind of gaseous substance, which basically knocks him out temporarily. And then, of course, he's hoisted up. And in response to that, the entire, casket basically that he's in is filled with water. Keep in mind, this is all real. It's designed to look like a trick to the audience because they're like, oh man, this is crazy. Mysterio couldn't kill Spider-Man in front of everybody, right? It's not like he can march him out on stage, put a gun to the back of his head and shoot him, right? Because then they would all be like, my God, you killed a man. But like, if you make it look like a trick, then it's like, wow, that was so impressive. We watched a man die, but we're too foolish to know what actually happened, right? That kind of a thing. Now, at this point, you get this kind of plot device where basically Spider-Man Noir shoots webbing on his face, which like traps a bit of oxygen. And then he's like, the oxygen saved me from drowning, right? And then it's that kind of a thing. Now, honestly, it would kill him because he's exhaling CO2, right? So basically he's breathing in a poisonous substance. The oxygen would run out, but it's comic book logic. Roll with it. Don't ask too many questions, guys. If you try to take comic books too seriously, you're going to make yourself go crazy. And so, of course, he ends up basically making his escape. He fights Mysterio, kind of beats him up a little bit, and the day's more or less saved, and he frees Felicia Hardy and all that kind of stuff, and that's it. And then the Inheritor pops up. And that's kind of how this happens, right? These guys teleport into universes, right? Teleport into these spaces. And so when this guy arrives, Superior Spider-Man shows up. It's one of these things where literally Superior Spider-Man teleports in, grabs Spider-Man Noir, and teleports out. And that's it. Because by this point in time, as this kind of conversation begins to progress and we start to get into the next part of our little story here, that what you have is basically the realization by Superior Spider-Man they can't beat this guy as a small number. Hence the reason why the entire team was formed. And so what you get is a different reality where you basically have Cyborg Spider-Man. He's pretty cool, right? He looks pretty amazing. This Inheritor shows up, and then you actually end up finding out that at some point along the line, Superior Spider-Man visited Cyborg Spider-Man and informed him of what was going on. That seemingly the Inheritor would come after him somewhere along the line, and that ultimately when that happens, he actually ends up calling in all these different Spider-Men, right? So like Spider-Man India, Spider-Man Noir, the Superior Spider-Man, Spider-Girl, right? So like Ashley Barton from the Old Man Logan universe. She was amazing. Oh my God, I loved her character so much in Old Man Logan. Dude, you guys remember that? She was all like helpless and she needed to be saved, and then like once she was saved, she was like, I'm ruling everything now. She like turned out to be a villain. It was awesome. By the way, if you guys want to see like the origins or explanations on any of the characters that we cover here that you're not like familiar with, let me know. And like I'll make, we'll kind of like pause the series for a second and make videos about some of these characters, because I feel like some of you guys are going to want to know like the origins of these guys and things along those lines. But ultimately they all end up teaming up against this Inheritor, and they actually draw this really cool conclusion. Superior Spider-Man realized that while this guy is going around killing Spider-Man, that what he's doing is absorbing their energy. And so finding a way to reverse engineer that process, he could actually use that energy against him, right? They could basically siphon that energy off of him and basically make him weak. The nature of Ashley Barton, right? Like the daughter of Hawkeye, the nature of her is she's kind of like, okay, we got to kill this guy, right? Like we got to take this guy out. And it's one of the things where the other Spider-Men are like, really? Like you want to kill? Like, I mean, are you sure about that? And then like Assassin Spider-Man's like, yeah, man, he's been killing us, right? Like we just got to eliminate this guy. Be done with it. Call it a day. Why would we let this guy live? He's going to find some way to escape. What do you think's going to happen? He's going to be in prison and then realize his heart was 3 sizes too small and he's going to become a good guy and help us. Is that really what you think is going to happen? No, he's a villain. Kill him. And so there's this kind of big debate that goes on there. But Superior Spider-Man steps in and says, before we kill this guy at all, we need information, right? And so he asks him, like, what's your mission? And the response to the Inheritor is like, there is no mission, right? This is what my kind does. We kill spiders. It's our way. As for others like me, pray you never meet the rest of my family. And that's when it takes Superior Spider-Man by surprise, like, wait a minute. There's more than one of you? And his response is like, oh yeah, there's more than one of us. And so the question Superior Spider-Man asked here is, will my weapon function as well against these others? I warn you, I will know if you lie. And the response to this guy is, I mean, sure, like, it'll function as well against the others as it does against me, which is completely and totally ineffective, and then just like breaks out, right? And it's just like, I was just wanting to hear what you guys were saying. I just wanted to hear what your plan was, understand what you guys were doing. And this massive fight breaks out. Now, all these Spider-Man are facing one Inheritor. They're doing what they can, but at the end of the day, even for just one Inheritor, they're all being painfully overpowered, right? I mean, like, they're attacking as best they can, but they can't kill this guy, right? Like, all they can do is kind of throw him around, pummel him a little bit. They set him on fire and it doesn't work. And then it's just like, okay, this could not possibly get any worse. And they're suddenly met by the arrival of two other Inheritors. Now, of course, you learn this guy we've been following the whole time, his name is Karn, but basically he's kind of seen as like a shameful member of the family, not as powerful. It's just kind of shame that he carries. And we'll talk more about that later. But like, these other two showing up, if there was ever a fight to be had here, it's long since gone. They overpower these guys with a quickness, right? These Inheritors, they overpower these Spider-Man so fast. And like, Superior Spider-Man's like, we have to go. We can't stay here. If we stay here, we're all gonna die. I'm sounding a retreat. And some of them don't want to, but it's like, no, like you guys remember that scene from Aliens when Hicks was like, Marines, we are leaving. It's that, right? I mean, it's a massacre. It's them just like trying to live. And so ultimately, the Inheritors end up fighting amongst themselves, and that's just what Superior Spider-Man and those guys need, is to basically have a distraction to make their escape. They open their portals and they bail. They immediately take off. And so following that, you have this kind of discussion that goes on where one, Superior Spider-Man ends up creating an arm for one of the Spider-Man to basically upgrade his cybernetic devices so he can, hack into the systems from Alchemax without being detected. And he's like, your job is to hunt for the names of the Inheritors throughout the entire history that Alchemax has at their disposal. If they're moving through universes, it also means they're moving through time. So they could appear at any point in time across the entirety of the multiverse. If they're hunting Spider-Man, there's a good chance they've appeared in the past. Find their names. And that assignment actually ends up going out to the six-armed Spider-Man as well, right? To kind of hunt throughout the entirety of the time stream, space and time itself, and find some reference for these guys anywhere. The next thing is it actually ends up going to Spider-Man India, and, well, he really calls him Turtleneck, but it's basically Spider-Man Noir, where he's like, you're going to find out where their home universe is. If they are hunting Spider-Man throughout the multiverse, then it means they're retreating somewhere. They're going somewhere. They live somewhere. Find their home. Whether it's an entire universe or some pocket dimension somewhere, find out where they live. And so what he actually ends up doing is pulling aside Ashley Barton and pulling aside Assassin Spider-Man. And this is one of the cool things, because these were the two who immediately said, we have to kill this Inheritor guy. And so one of the things Superior Spider-Man picked up on is that the other Spider-Men who were here are all very closely modeled after Peter Parker, right? They're just alternate reality versions of Peter in the sense that they almost exactly mirror his mannerisms, but also his moral compass. They're not willing to kill. And so it's one of the things that kind of goes on, because he says, I wanted to speak to the two of you privately. I feel we share a certain perspective that eludes our allies. And that's when Assassin Spider-Man's like, don't dance around it. We're killers. And Superior Spider-Man says, yes. He's like, I wasn't really dancing around it. It's more than that. The others may have killed in dire circumstances. I don't really know. But it's clear to me that we three have seen things that they have not. Brutality, devastation, darkness. The others think they've seen the worst that life has to offer because they've lost a loved one or two. But we have seen the face of true evil, and we understand what is required to stop it. This is incredibly important because he goes on to say, these beings we fight belong to the same family. To end their threat, we may have to commit a genocide. And by way of that, we may find our allies standing in our way. I.e., if it comes down to it, I need to know you're willing to kill other Spider-Men in order to ensure we can end this threat. It's pretty extreme, right? It's just that severe of a conflict in the eyes of Superior Spider-Man. What's going on, guys? This is Rob, and we are back with Spider-Verse, and you guys really seem to enjoy the last video that we did, so we're gonna do more. This one in particular is very, very interesting. So here's one thing that I want to preface before we get into this. There are a few things going on within the Marvel Universe and Multiverse at the same time this is happening, and that actually lead up to it, specifically the events of Infinity. So basically Thanos fighting the Inhumans and the Terrigen Bomb, as well as the incursions. We'll explain that once we get to it. But the other thing is that following this, we're going to jump into Edge of Spider-Verse. And Edge of Spider-Verse is where you get a lot of the origins you guys have been asking for, right? So like the origin of Spider-Gwen, different things like that. So we'll kind of bring all that stuff together. And then once Edge of Spider-Verse finishes, we'll get into the actual main Spider-Verse. This is all prelude stuff. This is all the stuff leading up to, quote unquote, the main Spider-Verse event. And so what this does is this actually focuses, at least in this video, we're going to be focusing on Amazing Spider-Man Volume 3. Now the reason why that matters is because technically the events of Superior Spider-Man concluded. They're done. And when Superior Spider-Man ended, you went into Amazing Spider-Man 3, which was basically Peter Parker getting his body back. The reason why you still see Superior Spider-Man is because prior to the ending of his story, Spider-Verse took place. So he was thrown into the multiverse. He's currently outside of time. So it's like Dr. Octopus taking over the body of Peter Parker on a Monday, the entire Spider-Verse event happens on a Tuesday, and then on a Wednesday, Peter gets his body back. So it's just one of those weird things, right? It's just something to wrap your head around. I know it seems a little strange, but what this also does is it brings in a character named Cindy Moon. Now, Cindy Moon was a really, really cool concept that Marvel wasted. And it really kind of sucked. So if you guys recall our discussion about the idea of spider totems, again, that was Marvel basically moving away from the idea that Peter Parker was just a kid who was bitten by a radioactive spider, and instead, him being bitten by that spider basically tied him into this kind of mystical connection that he had with all these other people who had been bitten by spiders and become spider people. Now, one of the things that Marvel did is they had an event called Original Sin. And all Original Sin did is it basically revealed all these things that we never knew about. It was a way for Marvel to kind of jumpstart stories they'd been looking to tell. And you learned some really, really cool stuff, right? Captain America being part of the Illuminati and then having his mind wiped and kicked out, different things along those lines. Cindy Moon was actually a girl who was bitten by the exact same spider that bit Peter Parker. And in fact, they happened within like minutes of each other. The spider bit Peter, it fell off, and then it bit Cindy on her ankle. The kicker to this is that if you recall our discussions about like Ezekiel Sims and all those guys, basically Ezekiel Sims realizing that like the inheritors were going around and killing people who were basically Spider-Man and Spider-Woman from across the multiverse, that when he encountered Cindy Moon and her powers started manifesting, he realized that the inheritors were after her. And so what he did is he locked her away in what was basically a bunker that had years worth of food. Now, she wasn't a prisoner. She could have left at any point in time. She had the access code to leave. But Ezekiel Sims basically said, if you do that, there's a good chance they'll find you and they will kill you if they do, right? There's no way you can fight them off on your own. So she was more of a prisoner by choice than anything else. Following the events of Original Sin and Peter Parker learning of Cindy Moon's existence, he basically rescued her. And then there was like a whole series of events where she was pissed off. But because of the fact that she's part of the spider totems and she has the name The Bride, essentially her and Peter Parker just can't stop banging. That's really what it means. Like, if they are in a vicinity of each other, like literally it happens here, where like they're talking, he's showing her the internet, and he's like, okay, when you were locked away, yeah, it was AOL and Netscape. For those of you guys who were that old to remember that kind of stuff. I do. I remember AOL. But he says, like, nowadays, it's all Facebook and all that kind of stuff. They're literally within a foot of each other. The pheromones start kicking in, and they want to start banging. And it happened for a while. When they first met, they couldn't stop banging. It was crazy. It was hilarious, but it was crazy. And so, again, with Anna Maria Marconi being here, of course, again, she initially met Dr. Octopus, believing he was Peter Parker. All that stuff took place during Superior Spider-Man. Then she's like, okay, no, we're not having you guys doing this. This is not going to happen. She literally starts spraying him with water in order to make him stop. And so Cindy Moon finally gives up, and she ends up basically taking off to find her own place. Now, following that, what you actually end up getting is this great big huge kind of calamity where you basically have Minerva. The reason why this matters is like Minerva fighting the cops and things like that. It's not overall important to the Spider-Verse event, but it is cool. And the weird thing is that Minerva is one of those characters Marvel just never really updated her. So to give you guys perspective, Minerva was a character who was basically a member of the Kree race, and she traveled to Earth to meet the original Captain Marvel of the Kree, the guy, and then wanted to bang him in order to basically jumpstart the Kree's evolution. The reason why is because at one point in their history, the Kree had gotten their hands on something called the Crystal of Ultimate Vision, but because they wanted to use it for nefarious purposes, it basically froze their evolutionary state so they never aged. Marvel fixed that with a story called Operation Galactic Storm, where basically the Kree race was almost totally obliterated, and because of that, their evolution was forced, and so there really isn't a need for Minerva to exist anymore. That's why you see her here and there occasionally, but she never matters because Marvel never changed the motivation. It's like she never knew that Operation Galactic Storm happened, right? I don't know how she didn't know. She was there when it did, but nonetheless, it's one of those weird little things. This this matters because the whole situation with this going on with Minerva actually gets the attention of basically Kamala Khan, of Miss Marvel. And she's a great character. I love the character of Miss Marvel. Her basically stepping in and intervening actually leads to her and Spider-Man teaming up, which is cool. But Kamala Khan is one of these characters where she had basically come about as a result of the Terrigen bomb detonating. So prior to the events of what was going on here with Spider-Verse, what you had, it was a story called Infinity, which was part of a larger story that dealt with the incursions. And we'll talk about that here in a little bit. But Infinity was really its own self-contained story. So you can read that of its own accord and actually not read anything else involving Hickman's Avengers and New Avengers, and for the most part be fine. You'll probably have to do a little bit of internet researching to kind of get caught up on some things that don't make sense. But the overall gist here is that Thanos had formed the Cull Obsidian and was basically traveling around the multiverse trying to find his offspring and kill them. That eventually led him to Earth, where he learned his child existed among the Inhumans. He ended up getting in a fight with Black Bolt, and in the conflict, one of the most amazing moments in the story. Dude, there's this amazing moment in Infinity. Dude, I love this moment. It's like one of the best moments ever, where like Thanos is fighting Black Bolt, and he was like, tell me where my son is, and Black Bolt's like, no, right? Like, anytime he talks, it's a quasi-sonic scream, so like, he basically, just emanates this massive amount of energy, like this huge concussive blast, and like, he's like screaming at Thanos, and it's not working, and Thanos is like, fine, keep your secrets, carry them with you to the grave, and like, smashes his head in the ground. It's just this ridiculously amazing moment. But in any event, basically Black Bolt detonated the Terrigen bomb, which spread Terrigenesis across the world, and then all these people who carry the Inhuman genes and didn't know it suddenly went into a state of Terrigenesis. Quite literally, they were just like kind of encased in these ugly looking cocoons, and then they would just manifest in whatever form it happened to take, right? Very similar to how mutants suddenly just develop powers based on their X gene, usually during like puberty or high levels of stress, but Kamala Khan is one of those. Now, what made Kamala Khan so cool in her early stories by G. Willow Wilson is, one, the family dynamic, right? The fact that she came from a very traditional family, but she actually wanted to do like very American things, which were considered to be very much against what her family stood for. But she was also like really new to the superhero scene. So like meeting heroes for the first time and then basically just fangirling, it was hilarious. I love the original run of Kamala Khan, and so that's why when like Spider-Man shows up, she's like, "You're Spider-Man! Holy cow! I'm gonna team up with Spider-Man. This is amazing!" And then she starts asking him stuff like, "Did you really go on a date with Miss Marvel with like Carol Danvers? Like, what was she like? What kind of music does she dig?" She's like the ultimate Carol Danvers fangirl. But it was a cool little thing. Of course, she really became, kind of stepped into her own and became a more solidified character. But one of the things that Minerva's doing is that because she's trying to like jumpstart Kree physiology, she basically ends up taking this kind of Inhuman and then seemingly bonding them with Kree DNA for the purpose of like allowing them to manifest and kind of go forward accordingly. What follows after this isn't really interesting at all. They fight the thing and then they basically win and like the day's saved and you got some cool moments where some stuff happens. In all honesty, it's basically filler to justify the existence of the comic, to basically fill it up with space. One of the things that does happen here is you actually end up seeing Cindy Moon fashioning like an official costume for herself, having one of the more popular costumes that exists in the Spider universe. But basically everything's kind of cool and everything's copacetic and the day's saved and that's basically it. The meat and potatoes of this and the real takeaway from this comes by way of Spider UK. And again, these are the kind of backup features that you saw during these events of Spider-Man that largely dealt with basically the Spider-Verse event kind of leading into the whole thing. And so what ends up happening here is that you basically have a kind of situation where Spider UK almost has this kind of experience that like something's wrong in the multiverse involving the various Spider-Man. And in fact, he's actually using the ability to scan the multiverse to essentially figure all this stuff out. Now, there's a few things we have to explain in terms of why this happens. So Spider UK is part of what's called the Captain Britain Corps, and its name is Billy Braddock. So the Captain Britain Corps is a multiversal team. For those of you guys who are unfamiliar with this, if you guys know about it, bear with me here for a second. I feel like we're going to get a lot of new viewers who have never heard of this before. The Captain Britain Corps is a multiversal superhero team. They're not particularly powerful, but take the Green Lanterns from like the DC Comics universe and make it a multiversal team, and that's basically the Captain Britain Corps. There's officially one Captain Britain for each universe, and what they have is something called the Lighthouse, which is like their base of operations, but it's also an interdimensional teleportation device, and it allows them to enter into what's called the Starlight Citadel. That's basically the base of operations for a woman named Saturnine, who's called the Omniversal Magistrix. Her job job is to like monitor the multiverse and make sure things don't pop off. A lot of people do that. The Living Tribunal does that. Alteza, the custodian of the multiverse, does that. And Saturnine does that. And then there's even more people who do that as well. But because of what's going on, because of the nature of the Starlight Citadel, and even the nature of the lighthouse itself, there is technology there that allows members of the Captain Britain Corps to scan the multiverse and to see what's going on. Because of what use would they be as a team if they weren't able to like communicate with each other, different things like that. And so what ends up happening is Billy Braddock actually looks into an alternate reality, which is Earth 1983 in New York City, and basically sees that in that universe that Morlun is there and is actually killing one of the Spider-Men and absorbing their power, right? Taking this guy out. The crazy thing about this is seemingly a universe where things were basically just cool. No one really fought. It was pretty lighthearted. So this guy's overcome pretty easily because evil doesn't really seem to be something that exists. So quite literally, he's encountering something he's never encountered before. And so literally, like, all these folks are killed at the hands of Morlun, and then that's it. Following that, he actually starts looking through all these different realities. That you've got two of the other inheritors that we saw in the last video, the brother and sister, Brix and Bora, who are actually killing one of the spider totems as a cat in this alternate universe. That you actually end up switching over to Deimos in Earth 7831. That guy is consuming actually an entire world full of anthropomorphic heroes, largely consisting of the Knights of Wondergore, which are basically individuals who were created by the High Evolutionary by basically modifying animal DNA, and they kind of spread out into the world and seemingly populated this world with anthropomorphic animals partly, and then also baseline humans. While the inheritors themselves are only supposed to feed on spiders, if a being has superpowers and they are animal in nature, they're part of that animal totem system. So that's the reason why like Morlun fought Black Panther as an example. They can feed on those, but by way of the instruction given to them by their father, they're not supposed to. They're only supposed to feed on spider totems. The other thing about this is you actually have Genix, who's kind of like the scientific arm of the inheritors, who actually realizes that Billy Braddock is spying on them, that this Spider-Man UK is watching them from some other place in the multiverse. So, of course, Billy Braddock is sort of like, we're gonna get you, that kind of a thing. But following that, he basically takes off and he goes to meet with Roma and Saturnine. Now, Roma is the daughter of Merlin, like the Merlin from Arthurian legend, right? Like, he's literally the one who founded the Captain Britain Corps, the Starlight Citadel, all that kind of stuff. He's the one that basically spearheaded all those things. Now, while all this is going on with Spider-Verse, you also have the incursions, universes crashing into each other. Basically, the collapse of the multiverse. That's the first and foremost pressing threat. That's the most important thing, keeping the multiverse from collapsing. But where you end up having, like literally Billy Braddock, who shows up here and tells Saturnine all the different Spider-Men and Spider-Women across the multiverse are being killed by the inheritors, she doesn't care. She's like, that's the least of my concerns. Entire universes are being destroyed. Cosmic entities are vanishing, right? The multiverse is collapsing. The least of my concerns are a bunch of Spider-Men and Spider-Women being killed by a crazy family. That I have no concern about that. Now, that's kind of the nature of Saturnine. She's just kind of a dick, right? That's just kind of the nature of her. She's pretty crass, pretty rude. There's very much like my way or the highway, that kind of thing. Roma was a far more nurturing hand, and that's why she's the one that listens to the appeal of Billy Braddock when he says, like, we have to do something about these. And her response is, look, we can't divert the efforts of the entire Captain Britain Corps to basically help you deal with the spider totems. I can help you out by giving you a device that'll let you basically travel through the multiverse, but that's the extent of it. Kind of the irony of all this, all these guys in the Captain Britain Corps, they get annihilated. When they meet the Beyonders, oh dude, the Beyonders just eradicate these guys. And I think it's really more the map makers than the Beyonders themselves, but it doesn't matter, right? Like the forces of the Beyonders, these guys get crushed. The only member of the Captain Britain Corps who lives is Brian Braddock from the main Marvel Universe. The Captain Britain Corps never had a chance. And in like a last-ditch effort, Saturnine opens a portal. She throws Brian Braddock through it, gives him all the information, and then the portal shuts. And that's the end of the Captain Britain Corps, right? They never stood a chance. But ultimately, Spider UK is given this ability to basically travel through the multiverse. And this is a huge asset, because while he doesn't necessarily have all the resources of the Captain Britain Corps at his disposal right now, he has a lot of experience with understanding the multiverse. And that in and of itself is a pretty big thing, because that will go a long way in basically helping the forces of Spider-Man 2099 and Superior Spider-Man and all those guys in dealing with the inheritors. Now, at this point, we switch over to our last little tidbit here, which is kind of leads into the official Edge of Spider-Verse story, but we basically end up picking up with Mayday Parker, which is essentially Earth 982. Now, Mayday Parker is a fan favorite. People absolutely love her character. She originally appeared in a What If story back in 1997. The What If story centered around the idea of like Peter Parker and Mary Jane Watson having a kid and actually being able to raise that kid. There was a point where Peter Parker in that alternate universe basically lost his leg and he ended up retiring. And then once his daughter Mayday started developing powers, he started training her to become a superhero, which is pretty cool. And that's basically what goes on here, right? It's the return of Mayday Parker after a pretty lengthy absence in Marvel Comics. But the whole thing about this is you've basically got one of the inheritors, which is actually Deimos, literally attacking Peter Parker of this reality and then attacking Mayday as well as Mary Jane Parker. And that's kind of the crazy thing, is because none of these guys really have a chance here, right? The power of the inheritors, they overcome them all. Now, Mayday was one of those characters where like she was one part fun, but she also had it where it counted. She was the girl you wanted in your corner when things started popping off. She would always try to find a way, right? This girl had like just non-stop optimism. And so despite the fact that it's basically a losing battle, this version of Peter Parker fights Deimos as best he can, but in the end, he knows it's basically just a distraction. His goal is to not actually defeat Deimos. I mean, if he does, he'll certainly be like, yeah, great. I mean, he wants to defeat the guy, but he also knows it's probably not going to happen. Deimos is just too strong, too powerful, too fast. He's far beyond the powers of just a normal spider person, right? Spider-Man, Spider-Woman, what have you. And so the instruction here is actually for Mayday to basically grab Mary Jane and her younger brother and herself and to get out of there as fast as she possibly can, right? To leave. It's Peter sacrificing his life to save his family. And so ultimately what ends up happening is Mary Jane hands the baby, the younger brother of Mayday, over to Mayday herself and says, get out of here, right? I'm right behind you. Everything's going to be cool. And then Mary Jane seemingly tries to stay to fight. Now, that was always a testament to the nature of Mary Jane Watson. In the early days of Marvel Comics, and when I say the early days, I mean like Mary Jane as a character, when it was Peter Parker and Gwen Stacy, Mary Jane was always kind of there, but she seemed really shallow. She seemed like there wasn't a whole lot of depth to her. She seemed very self-absorbed. And the idea is that when Gwen Stacy died, there was a moment there in the comics, it was beautifully written, there was a moment there in the comics when Peter lashes out at Mary Jane, and then Mary Jane chooses to stay. And that formed the relationship there, the two of them falling in love. And then it was really like Jerry Conway and those guys that followed suit, reworking and crafting Mary Jane Watson into a person that became a lot more responsible, a lot more concerned, a person that genuinely cared about Peter Parker, which she always kind of did, but she was far less self-absorbed. This is kind of like the fruition of that, right? The totality of that. What would that version of Mary Jane Watson look like if her and Peter Parker had gotten married, they had a kid, all that kind of stuff. And so that's why the family dynamic of these characters is so cool. Of course, Mayday basically takes off with half of her mind knowing her mom's going to stay behind, and that's exactly what happens, right? Both her mom and her dad are basically killed. There is a bit of hope for her that like Peter Parker survives, but what you end up having is the arrival of the forces of like Superior Spider-Man and those guys to rescue Mayday Parker. And when she's like, well, I mean, it's like we can go save my dad, the response is, no, your dad's gone. Right? We arrived here too late. Peter Parker's dead. That's when Deimos comes out and is like, yeah, I absorbed the powers of Peter Parker. He's totally killed. Like, there's no one here to save you now. Either you can stay here and die, or you can flee as fast as you can, but understand, there's nowhere you can go. We will find you no matter where you go in this multiverse. And so that kind of sets in stone this notion or this idea of Mayday Parker to take out the inheritors no matter what it takes, no matter what happens. She wants to come out on top of this. That's a huge motivation for her character going into the future of the story. What's going on, guys? This is Rob, and we are back with Spider-Verse. Specifically, as promised, we are covering Edge of Spider-Verse. Now, for those of you guys who don't know what that is, Edge of Spider-Verse, and we technically already covered part 1, but Edge of Spider-Verse was a 5-part miniseries that basically covered the origins of like different Spider-esque characters from across the multiverse, some of whom ended up joining the various, the great big huge Spider-Man team as part of Spider-Verse, and others who actually were killed by the Inheritors. So it's a really, really cool concept. This one in particular is the origin of Spider-Gwen, and this one's nuts because here's the crazy thing. When this story came out, it's one of those rare instances in this day and age when a character is introduced in comics and immediately explodes in popularity. It was actually the costume that made Spider-Gwen so popular when she first came out, because the costume design was fantastic. But like literally that year at like Comic-Cons everywhere, like you just saw girls running around as like Spider-Gwen. It was nuts how popular she was. But what this does is it initially opens up basically at Midtown High School, right? Midtown being the school that Peter Parker went to, so a lot of similarities that we know of between this alternate reality Spider-Man story and the main Marvel Universe. Universe story, but basically Gwen Stacy plays in a band called the Mary Janes, which my initial idea was like, man, how arrogant could you be that you named a band after yourself? But Van Halen did the same thing, and their band was amazing. The thing about this is that we get this kind of flashback, right? Now, this is her first appearance in comics, and so Jason Latour plays it fast and quick with her origin, in the sense that all we really know is that basically she was bitten by a radioactive spider, and that in turn, she went on to become a superhero. But unlike the main Marvel Universe, where Captain Stacy, the father of Gwen, was someone that became an ally of Spider-Man, in this instance, he's actually an enemy of Spider-Gwen, all the while totally unaware of the fact that his daughter is Spider-Gwen. So that added a really cool dynamic. On top of that, Peter Parker never became Spider-Man. Instead, he's just basically an introverted kid in a school that gets picked on all the time. And so Gwen Stacy is the one saving him, and in a pursuit to become something comparable to her, he actually ended up becoming the Lizard instead. And during some kind of a conflict, which is never explored here in the story, he basically ends up dying. And so following that, what you get is J. Jonah Jameson that puts forward this idea that basically Peter Parker died at the hands of Spider-Gwen, and that he has to be avenged, right? The superheroes are basically being viewed as vigilantes, and they can't be allowed to go around and operate in that capacity, right? So the cool thing about this is that with that little bit out of a way, she kind of gets lost in herself as she's playing in this band, right? Just kind of getting lost and sort of, you know, getting carried away. And of course, you know, she's told by the band, hey, let's just take a break, right? Remember, we have our concert coming up. And so you get basically this kind of big struggle that Spider-Gwen goes through. And this is one of the things that really brought a lot of people on board. Spider-Gwen was hugely popular among girls, which, if I'm being honest with you guys, Marvel needed that at the time, right? Marvel didn't have a whole lot of heroes that resonated with the female audience. And so, you know, by and large, there weren't a whole lot of people that women could have a camaraderie with. And so one of the things that a lot of just young people in general struggle with is like the coming of age thing, right? A lot of you guys who are in your teenage years, and those of you guys who remember your teenage years, you remember what it was like, right? You're trying to fit in, you're trying to understand your place in the bigger picture, you're trying to figure out who you are. So you're making friendships, but you're not even sure if the friends you have are going to be your friends for the rest of your life. You want to make sure you maintain those relationships, but you also know you're changing. It's a very, very confusing and difficult time that I think is exacerbated by the nature of social media. But the thing about this is that she's basically struggling with this idea that one part of her feels guilt over the death of Peter Parker, but there's another part of her that's like, I'm not the one who's responsible for this. So while the world is telling her it's your fault Peter died, she knows it's not. But she can never really share her identity with seemingly anybody around her, let alone her father. Her father's a cop, and her father's hunting Spider-Gwen. And so there's no real knowing what would happen if she dumped her identity to her father. Now, there does come a moment when she almost does, when she almost tells her dad who she is, what's going on, you know, and it kind of makes sense, right, given the relationship between her and her father, and really between most girls and their father, that as time progresses, girls become closer to their dads, and then they become closer to their moms. And so in this instance, her father is the only real parental figure she has. It's the only real person she feels like she can go and talk to anything about. And so if there were any person she could have this conversation with, it would be him. But before she gets the chance, she's actually basically tracked down by a cop who, of course, doesn't necessarily shoot her on the spot, but actually tries to. And that's kind of the extent of how she's viewed here. That in some ways, it was pretty dark, right? He tells her, like, freeze, put her hands up, you know, all that kind of stuff, you know, the things you normally expect to hear when a cop is, like, you know, trying to arrest you, essentially. And of course, she's dodging and moving out of the way and so on and so forth, but he fires a few shots at her and tries to kill her. And she actually, you know, ends up basically webbing him up so he can't do anything, and then puts in a call saying shots fired, and, you know, a bunch of cops show up, and she actually makes her escape, and these cops continue tracking her down. What this does is it says there's basically no safe place for Spider-Gwen. And this is starkly different from the Spider-Man mythos that we're used to. And that was one of the best things about Edge of Spider-Verse, because this is the tip of the iceberg, right? Wait till we get to the story about the Spider-Man who bites Mary Jane Watson. That gets nuts, right? That story gets crazy. It's like a horror story more so than anything else. What you actually also end up getting here is basically Matt Murdock, who's actually a villain, right? Which is kind of crazy, right? It's one of the cool things about this. And so you basically have him talking to Alexi, who is really this alternate realities version of Rhino from Marvel Comics, is really all he is. But as the two of them are talking, basically, he's being set upon Captain Stacy, right? Just a desire to take this guy out. Because Captain Stacy's not necessarily a bad cop, right? Like, I mean, he's trying to track down Spider-Gwen because in his mind, she's a criminal, a vigilante as far as he's aware. He's doing what he's instructed to do as a member of law enforcement. But more so than that, he takes down big criminals, different things along those lines. So he's as much an issue for Spider-Gwen as he is for like Matt Murdock and any of those guys. And so following this, of course, as you expect, much like if you're familiar with Spider-Man for the main Marvel Universe, this girl can't be on time anywhere. That's kind of the thing about Spider-Man, right? Peter Parker, this guy couldn't be on time if he had like a giant purple clock sitting in front of his face telling him what time it was, right? Like he still couldn't be on time. And so ultimately she's actually late for her own concert with the Mary Janes. Now, there is a little bit of a saving grace here in the sense that like with no drummer there, people are kind of like, I mean, this is a little weird seeing a band with no drummer. But then like Alexi busts in with the intention of going after Captain Stacy, right? Spider-Gwen shows up just at that moment and of course throws on her suit and then immediately goes through to try to save her dad. But it's kind of a little bit of a saving grace, right? Before anybody could realize, hey, this girl's missing, you know, outside of the band. Like this band sucks, right? If it went on for like 15 minutes, people would be like, yeah, this band sucks. They don't have a drummer. This is weird. Let's go next door and get some drinks. That's basically what it would turn into. But you get this thing where Rhino actually gets the upper hand on her. And a lot of this seems to be because she's still fairly new to this, right? She's still fairly new to being a spider character and understanding